Hi, good morning everybody, and first it's my first time at MacGill, and I'm delighted to be here. I think the first person I met this morning was Joe, and he said, "You're younger than I expected," and my response was, "I'm not as young as I look, and I've aged a lot in the last week." So I'm going to just briefly, I suppose I could talk about so many different things, so to try and compress down into an interesting 15-minute presentation, I'm really going to try and talk about the changing face of Ireland, and primarily through the Census 2016 data. So it's the most recent set of data that we actually have that tries to tell us something about our society and about our culture, and of course which is absolutely central for planning purposes. So that's, I'm after turning it off, am I? Sure. There we go. Sorry about that. Technical stuff. So I think, one of the first things is, a lot of people, we operate under the radar primarily. That's how we like to operate. We're interested in facts, and we're delivering the facts without any spin or any agenda, because we don't have any spin, we don't have any agenda. We're just interested in telling the stories. And of course, the work of CSO has real-world consequences, and if anybody was unclear about that, I think the last week has clearly identified that the statistics we do compile do have real-world consequences, and we're very conscious of that in the CSO, and we're very careful about what we do, and we do things in a very professional way. Obviously, the figures we compile have a serious role in trying to highlight economic progress or economic decline, as our figures showed during the recent recession. Obviously, the statistics we use are important for policymakers to help them make decisions, but they're also used by the business community to make decisions. They're used by local communities all over Ireland, and of course they're used by non-governmental organisations and the public to inform themselves as to what's happening in the state. And we have an important role to do in putting that information into the public domain. Of course, our role is important from an international perspective, because if you think of the likes of the ratings agencies like Moody's and Standards & Poor's, they make their determination about Ireland's investment status not exclusively, but certainly based on the data compiled by the CSO. So we're very conscious of that and of the role we play there. And of course, finally, I think the data we compile is really, really important in trying to get an understanding of society and societal issues and changes. And I think there's probably no better place to start than the recent census figures to try and highlight that. So Census 2016 is only 12 weeks ago, and we've already published first estimates. I think we're one of the fastest in the world, even though we do a traditional census, to get the data out. It's a preliminary count, but the preliminary figures generally are very much in line with the final figures. And as you can see, the population now is 4,757,976. And of course, they're living in the housing stock of, well, they're not all living on, they're not all occupied dwellings, which I'll talk about later, but the housing stock is just over 2 million now, 2,022,895. And I think it's probably just interesting sometimes, statisticians love trends and graphs, and it kind of highlights change over time. And you can see Ireland's population was at its highest back in 1841, and you can see the impact of the famine. So in a sense, statistics captures heritage as well, not just stories. It's stories of our culture and where we've come from. But I want to just draw your attention to the graph from 1996 up to 2016. And what's interesting there is that our population has grown by 1 million people in 20 years. Now that's a very interesting statistic. And trying to, if you think about that from a planning perspective and a service provision perspective, I think that's a challenge for anybody. And especially in a country of ours, like an increase of 1 million out of a total population now of about 4.757 million. That's a major change for any country to have to try and deal with. So why do we have a census? And I suppose, obviously people mightn't be aware of it. The census figures underpin almost every other statistic we compile in the CSO. It's a sampling frame, it's a grossing frame for our employment data, our unemployment data, our income statistics, statistics on poverty, things like GDP per capita, which determine our net contribution to the EU, and the per capita piece comes from the census. So this is all really, really important. So we really can't do anything without good quality census data. Obviously, it's critical for planning and service provision right across a whole range of areas: education, health, transport, childcare, but of course pensions as well. And of course pensions, as Mary has mentioned, is one of the big things we're all thinking about, and pension provision. And we've got a population, we're living older and we're living longer, and the proportion of the population in the older cohort is increasing. And that's an upward trajectory. So we need to be thinking about that and planning for that. But one of the real values of the census actually is the ability to compile accurate data down at the local area level. So not just at the Irish level, not down at the NUTS 3 regional levels, not even down at the county level, but right down at the local community level. You know, the number of GA clubs and rugby clubs that contact me to, you know, they're putting in requests for money from the lottery and they want statistics for their local area, and all they have to do is point them to the website. You know, so it's really, really important for local communities as well. So one of the things that I think it's useful just to think about is, what are the components of population change? What drives, and I mean, this is really important in Ireland, where we've grown by 1 million in 20 years. So what drives population change in Ireland? And this is just a graph of population change, and everything above the hard black line is growth in the population. But what you can see is that our population is still growing, but not as quickly as it was in previous intercensal periods. That's all that graph tells you. But population change is made up of two components: the natural increase, which is the difference between births and deaths, and you can see that's I wouldn't say it's a flat line, but it's quite a flat line. But net migration. So just look at the graph of net migration and the graph of population change, and that tells you what you need to know about what drives change in our population over time. Net migration is the biggest determinant on our population. So if I think about the fact that our population has changed by 1 million over the last year, it's actually quite interesting to see, okay, but what's the composition of that million? And what are the challenges around that? And of course, we're a very different society now than what we were 20 years ago. Far more multicultural. So it's a very different type of population change to what you might have seen historically. So, as I mentioned to you, the population is still growing, and you can see in the intercensal period between 2002 and 2006, the population grew by just over 290,000. From 6 to 11, it grew by about 348,000. But now the population growth is just at around 170,000. So we're still growing, but at a slower pace. And of course, a big driver of that, and that's not a surprise to anybody, is net migration, because we've gone through a period now where we've had, on balance over the 5 years, net outward migration. I think the last time we saw that in Ireland was actually back in the 86 to 91 census. That's the last time we saw net outward migration from Ireland. So, very quickly, if you just look at population change in Ireland, and this is the percentage change broken down by county. The dark red, obviously, is where you have population growth in excess of 6%. And the green is actually where you see population decline between 2011 and 2016. And we can see Donegal, where we are today, actually has seen a decline in population of 1.5% between 2011 and 16. Sligo pretty much stayed static, but a slight decline in their population. And Mayo, again, a slight decline in their population. As against that, you can see that red dot is actually, that's one of the administrative counties in Dublin. That's the Fingal area. Fingal has seen a growth of 8% in its population between 2011 and 2016. But, you know, figures are figures, but what do they mean? But if you draw a line pretty much down the middle of the country, you can see an east-west divide in terms of the population change here. And again, it's not a surprise. Perhaps we all knew that this was there, but it's very different when you have the hard data and you can actually see it. So with the exception of Cork, and I think it's Longford, the strong population growth is all in around the 4 administrative counties in Dublin and that commuter belt around Dublin, broadly speaking. And in the west of Ireland, we're seeing slower growth or a decline in population. And that's just, I think, sometimes the visual gives you a clearer sense of what's going on. And of course, as I said to you at the start, you know, so seeing it at county level sometimes can hide some interesting little pieces of information when you dig deeper. So we can now produce this type of data at local area level. So this is all the electoral divisions. And again, not surprisingly, you can see the population growth around the Dublin area. But interestingly, again, you can see around Cork City, but then around Limerick City, Galway City, you're seeing some growth in those areas. And that's quite interesting. But obviously the blue, which is the population declines, you can see very few of them on the eastern side of the country. Most of them, which are the population declines, are on the western side. So now we've produced a new product. It went out last week at our release, where you can actually get into an interactive map and you can zoom into your own local area. So this presents a map of Donegal and each of the electoral divisions in Donegal, and it shows you what the population change between 2011 and 2016 is. And you can see a lot of blues, which are declines. But even within Donegal, you can see some red areas, and those of you from around Donegal will probably be able to pick out, I don't know, is it Letterkenny, Donegal Town, these kind of places, I'm not sure. But you can even drill in lower than that, and I've pulled up the figures for Glenties. And the change in population over the last 5 in Glenties has actually seen a decline in population of just under 5% between 11 and 16. But that's the value of this type of data. It's the value of being able to compile data at the lower level. So it provides the opportunity not for broad brush policy intervention, but for targeted policy interventions. So the more granular the detail in the data we can provide, the greater the scope for targeted policy interventions, as distinct from sometimes from broad brush policy interventions. And that's the power of the data. We've also seen, and it's a bit like the East-West, we're seeing an urban-rural divide as well beginning to grow. And you can see back in 1961, I think it's almost 54% of the population lived in rural Ireland. That's now reversed. So now you have over 62% living in urban Ireland. So this rural to urban, you can see it in the data. And actually what's quite interesting is if you look at which part of obviously Dublin, a big city, is a big part of that. But actually the fastest growing urban population is in towns of 10,000 people or more. And that's what I just highlighted there. So there's some messages here as well for us and for policymakers and for decision makers around where the population growth is and about rural depopulation and moving into urban areas. So if I move on from the population to talk about the housing stock, and I think this is very relevant in the context of discussions around homelessness and that, and we will be publishing data on homelessness later when we have the final figures which start coming out from March 17 onwards. But again, you can see the housing stock, back in 2002 was 1.46 million. It's now just over 2 million. But the annual intercensual change is quite interesting. You can see, 201,000, 309,000, 234, down to just under 19,000. And again, that's no surprise to anybody because we know what happened to our construction sector. We know we stopped building houses. It just tells you the scale of the change that we've seen in the development of our housing stock. But the housing stock, the dwellings, of course, can be broken down into a number of constituent parts. Obviously, occupied households, up about 50,000 over the 5 years since 2011. Temporary absent, down about more or less no change. Holiday homes up about 2,000, just under 2,000. But other vacant dwellings, just now it has declined by about 13.8% between 11 and 16. But now it's just around 200,000. And that's, people bandy these vacant dwellings numbers around, and there's the answer to all your questions, but it's never as simple as that. So where are the vacant dwellings? Are they in places where those houses can actually be used to help homelessness? Can they be used to, facilitate people who want to commute to work, etc.? And you can see that the lowest vacancy rates are where you'd expect. They're up in, Dublin, Fingal, Dunleary, Rathdown, Kildare, Wicklow, where I'm from myself. Big commuter towns all around that Dublin area. But then a lot of the highest vacancy rates are down around Leitrim, Roscommon, Mayo, Longford. So it's interesting when you actually start to drill down. And this is just a simple map where you can see where the vacant dwellings are. And the blue are those parts of the country where the highest vacancy rates are. So you can start to drill into this data now in the exact same way as we drilled into the population. So you can go into your own local area and see what the vacancy rate in your own local area is. And then again, that's very useful now for policymakers if they want to, or not if they want to, of course they want to, but they can use that type of data now to consider, the value of these vacant houses, how they can be used to address things like homelessness, how they can be used to address things like where people are having to live vis-a-vis where they have to work and the commuting distances that people have. So this is all really, really important for policymakers. Given, I think, Joe mentioned Brexit, I just kind of felt it was important to throw in a little bit here about, the the Brexit debate. These data are from 2011, but we will have data from 2016, of course, similarly. And on the left-hand side, you can see the light blue dots are where people in Northern Ireland live, and then the purple is where they go and work in Ireland. So you have people living in the north who come over the border into Ireland every day for work purposes, and you can see a lot of them are working around the border, but a lot of them are actually travelling right down into Dublin. And then the right-hand map, you can see, again, you've got people who are living in Ireland, so the reddish dots, they're people who live in Ireland, and where do they work in the north? So these are the people who live in Ireland but commute up to the north, and you can see some into Derry, obviously, some into Belfast. And then, interestingly, a lot of people who live in Dublin who are commuting into the north. This is interesting to have this kind of data, especially with a discussion around what's going to happen around border controls. So this is real data that can help inform the discussion and highlight the importance, I suppose, of the whole cross-border movement, just even purely from a labour market perspective. And that's only one perspective. There are a whole range of perspectives. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'm sorry now I'm going so fast because there's an awful lot of information, Mary. Am I 15 minutes up? I'm nearly there. But this is kind of a technical thing. It's called the dependency ratio, and statisticians love these proportions and that. But the dependency ratio is just the proportion of the dependent population to the proportion of the active population. So the total figure is people 0 to 19 and 65 and over. Don't shoot me. I know people 65 and over are definitely productive. But just for the purposes of international comparisons, just for international statistical purposes, but it's almost just to give us a sense of the challenge we face. So the red line is the dependency ratio for the state. But of course, there are young dependents and older dependents. So the younger dependents there are the proportion of the population 0 to 19 expressed as a percentage of the population 20 to 64. And the blue at the bottom is the proportion of the population 65 and over expressed as a percentage of the 20 to 64s. And what you can see is that our dependency ratio, so this is about population projections up to 2046. So we're projecting an increase in population, but you can also see there's an increase in the dependency ratio anticipated. But I suppose what's really interesting about this for policymakers is the composition of the dependency. Traditionally, years ago, the dependency was heavily weighted towards the younger cohort. And of course, that had challenges for education, etc. But into the future, the challenge and the primary focus on dependency is going to be amongst the older cohort. And that comes back to healthcare provision and increasingly, and more importantly, pension provision. So figures like this, where you project them forward based on current trends, can help people to think about what are the things we need to be planning about for the future. I hope I didn't upset anybody with my dependency ratio comment. Just concluding comments. Ireland is a very, very fluid population. Just to give you some statistics, between 2006 and 2011, the gross flows in and out of the country between inward migration and outward migration, 750,000 people. Add to that the fact that every single year, 250,000 Irish people move home. So between 2006 and 2011, we had 2 million people out of 4.6 million people moving in this state. Well, that's a really, really staggering statistic. And that's critical for us in terms of, that's why we have to have a census in Ireland every 5 years. You've got such a fluid population. We have to have an accurate estimate of the population if we're going to be able to produce reliable official statistics on things like unemployment, poverty, etc. That's why Ireland has a census every 5 years, because we've got such a fluid population, and there it is in it's in hard facts. Migration drives our change in population, and that's something I think it's important for all of us to realise. So the change in migration drives the change in population. The word change is important there. Urbanisation, we have an east-west divide evolving and developing. Well, it's always been there, but it's becoming more, I suppose, a little bit more starker now. And of course, you have a rural-urban thing associated with that as well. You've got the whole issue of vacant housing and considering how the vacant housing, how we can use that information to try and help policy development now around the whole areas of homelessness, but also around things like, where people are having to live and where they're having to work and commuting patterns and all that. It's really, really important data. So I think, for us, the CSO's job is to shine lights on the facts, whether people like the facts or not. That puts us in a difficult position sometimes. Our job isn't to spin the data. Our job is to present the facts and then let decision makers and economists interpret the facts to try and help people make the right decisions for our future. But our job is to shine a light on all of these issues. And sometimes, just like last week around the GDP and GNP, we shone a light on what is a difficult issue. But that's our job, and hopefully we'll have a considered and a reflective debate around things like that. We bring together all the field supervisors. So we employ about 4,664 enumerators for the census. In total, we have about 5,000 people between field supervisors, etc. So we bring all the field supervisors together at the end of it, and we say, how did the census go in the field? And we have a lady from Wexford, and she's done, I think, 7 censuses, and she captured it very nicely. She said, Padraig, she said, the Ireland of Mary and Tom is gone. Yeah. She remembers the day where you'd be going around with the census form, it'd be, come in, have a cup of tea, it's great to see you. That's gone now. It was incredibly difficult. The message we were getting from the field was incredibly difficult to do the field work this time around. Number one, it was very hard, and the fair dues to the enumerators and the field staff for doing, because they did a fantastic job in a very difficult circumstances. But it's getting more and more difficult to get the information we need. And I think we now need information more than ever. So this has implications for us for the future. How do we do censuses in the future? Is it appropriate to do it in the current way? And this is perhaps why I'm also involved internationally in the modernisation of official statistics, is how can we modernise to address some of the problems? And there are huge opportunities for us into the future. So obviously an internet response option would be certainly on the cards for Census 2021. But there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of opportunities. So I hope I haven't taken up too much time, Mary, and hopefully you've all at least learned some little bit from my presentation. Thank you very much.